Well, good morning. This is the last of our presentations for Module 2. Let me get today's presentation up for you. Share screen. Here we go. Right. Yes, this is always a little more awkward than I would like for it to be. Okay. All right, we're all set now at this point. Here, of course, are the terms for the presentation, and it's listed as part one, but it's actually the entire lecture. I started off thinking I would cut it into two parts, and then discovered I didn't need to do that. Just to let you know, the presentation also uses a number of film clips and videos of recorded musical performances to illustrate its points. These are consider these part of the presentation. Some of the videos are optional, but most are required. By the end of this lecture, you should understand that the warrior code translates metaphorically into everyday life. The concepts of the persona, shadow, and collective unconscious advanced by psychologist Carl Jung. All three of these concepts are really important to understanding today's lecture. The concept of toxic masculinity. The four archetypes of the mature masculine and their characteristics. And finally, the significance of the term, "it is a good day to die." Now, in this presentation, we will examine the ways in which the code of the warrior translates into everyday life. Although in this case, the phrase might more accurately be called the warrior ethos. Ethos means the characteristic spirit of a culture, and in this case, of course, it's the warrior culture. The essence of the warrior spirit can succinctly be described as aggressive, disciplined action taken on behalf of a cause larger than oneself. And the people, the protesters at near the Ohio State House back in May 2020, the Black Lives Matter protest, one of them, and are an example of this. The woman in the foreground is quite striking in that respect. Civilians, as well as soldiers, can and do take aggressive, disciplined action on behalf of a cause larger than oneself. So the basic thrust of this presentation is that the qualities we associate with the code of the warrior are qualities that are not confined to the military dimension of human life, but are also apply to other dimensions of life. This is not a new idea. Bruce Lee, perhaps the most famous and influential martial artist of all time, championed the idea that there was a latent warrior inside each of us that could be mobilized in the service of creating a better life for ourselves or for our community. Forrest E. Morgan, a major in the U.S. Air Force, wrote a book about how to apply the warrior mindset, both to martial arts training and to daily life. Melba Pattillo Beals, one of 9 African-American teenagers who integrated Little Rock High School back in 1957, experienced months of vicious persecution in which she was taunted by her schoolmates and their parents, threatened by a lynch mob's rope, attacked with lighted sticks of dynamite, and injured by acid sprayed in her eyes. But through it all, she acted with dignity and courage and refused to back down. And so, in her classic memoir of that experience, she characterized herself as a warrior. And it was a deserved characterization because what she did required as much courage, determination, and will to win as a soldier on any battlefield. You also see the warrior ethos expressed in any number of other media, including songs. In fact, I would say almost especially in songs. Bruce Springsteen's The Rising, written and recorded in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, depicts the final moments of a New York City firefighter, told from the firefighter's point of view, as he climbs to what he knows is certain death, in obedience to his calling, which demands that he save the people trapped in the upper floors of one of the World Trade Center towers. I have posted videos of a number of songs exemplifying the warrior ethos, and for the most part, watching them is optional. But this stunning live performance of The Rising is required viewing. And finally, we have a fourth book that extols the warrior ethos, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, rediscovering the archetypes of the mature masculine, an influential book by psychology professor Robert L. Moore and mythologist Douglas Gillette. They used the mythical archetypes of king, warrior, magician, and lover as, in part, a therapeutic approach to helping their male clients recognize the crippling inadequacy of the conceptualization of what it meant to be a man that they had been taught since youth, and to replace that conception with one that would lead to a healthy, mature, and fulfilling life. One that, among other things, made them better fathers and properly respectful of women, and to reject patriarchy as fear-based, maladaptive, and destructive to men, as well as women. Now, Moore and Gillette were heavily influenced by the ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century. Jung pioneered several basic psychological concepts, but I will focus only on the ones that are most relevant to the warrior ethos. The first key concept is that we possess all human potentialities, but we choose, or often our families and society chooses for us, which potentialities to embrace and which to reject or hide. The parts we consciously accept, he termed the persona. The parts we reject most strongly, he called the shadow. The shadow basically has a negative connotation because he argued that we repress the darker sides of ourselves. They're still there, though, and finding it unbearable to acknowledge them in ourselves, we tend to project those negative characteristics onto others. The shadow is an area of the self so hideous that an individual cannot, without great effort, take ownership of it. It nonetheless manifests itself in the form of emotion, Jung said, and the cause of the emotion, he continued, appears to lie beyond all doubt in the other person, no matter how obvious it may be that it is a matter of projections, that he's projecting his own darkness onto somebody else. There is little doubt that the subject will perceive this himself. He must be convinced that he throws a very long shadow before he is willing to withdraw his emotionally toned projections from their object. Now, Jungian psychologists find that a simple but powerful way to identify a person's shadow is to ask them what kind of person they most dislike. And in my case, it's bullies. But to my chagrin, I long ago came to see that I myself can behave in a bullying fashion, and never more so than when I fail to see that I have that potentiality, or forget that I have that potentiality, since I became aware of it such a long time ago. Well, a self-aware person can manage, if not master, their shadow. But for a person lacking in self-awareness, their shadow owns them. Now, as you'll see, the concept of the shadow warrior, to be specific, will crop up when we examine Achilles in Homer's Iliad. And Moore and Gillette employ the shadow concept throughout their book. A second fundamental Jungian concept is the collective unconscious, that part of the unconscious mind which is derived from ancestral memory and experience and is common to all humankind, as distinct from the individual's personal unconscious. The mythic stories that emanate from the collective unconscious contain character types that play a specific role in the various mythic stories that are told the world over. And these kinds of characters are called archetypes. Now, the term archetype may not be familiar to you, but believe me, you're instinctively familiar with the concept. Clarice Starling, in The Silence of the Lambs, embodies an archetype of the hero, or in her case, the heroine. Morpheus in The Matrix is the archetype of the mentor. And Han Solo in Star Wars is the archetype of the shapeshifter, and so on. For our purpose, the hero is the most relevant archetype because he corresponds most closely to the warrior. Although in war movies, mentor figures are also warriors, experienced veterans able to advise and guide the hero as the hero enters into the world of combat. The warrior is one of 4 archetypes that Moore and Gillette viewed as the archetypes most relevant to the development of a fully realized, mature man. But before I get into them, I want to emphasize that since Jung believed that people had all potentialities, this is by no means an assertion that women cannot possess a warrior ethos or behave as warriors. Jung would never have agreed with that. Rather, he recognized that these human potentialities in mythology, in mythic terms, tended to be expressed in terms of men as having certain archetypal features, and women having others. He would have approved of the idea that we all have what would stereotypically be called a masculine and a feminine side. And the emerging ideas about identities that reject the binary model of masculine and femininity just would further illustrate Jung's convictions about the omnipotentiality of human beings. Moore and Gillette would not have denied this either. But to repeat a point made earlier, they believed that too many men had unhealthy ideas about what it meant to be a man. And these unhealthy ideas led them to damage themselves and often abuse others. The devastating fact, they wrote, is that most men are fixated at an immature level of development. These early developmental levels are governed by inner blueprints appropriate to boyhood. And although they become men physiologically, eventually, psychologically, they remain boys. They go on to say, the drug dealer, the wife beater, the unfaithful husband, the father who can never find time to attend his daughter's school programs. All these men have something in common. They are all boys pretending to be men. They got that way honestly because nobody showed them what a mature man is like. Their kind of manhood, so-called, is a pretense to manhood, or pretense of manhood, that goes largely undetected as such by most of us. Most of us are taken in by the idea that these are real men, these are real grown-up men. We are continually mistaking this man's controlling, threatening, and hostile behaviors as strength. In reality, he is showing underlying extreme vulnerability and weakness, the vulnerability of the wounded boy. This is sometimes called toxic masculinity. And I'll tell you a story connected with this. Do you remember Joe Gilmartin, the guy who did the definition of war, the working definition of war that I mentioned the other day? As you may recall, Joe had been an Air Force helicopter pilot during the Vietnam War. He won a Silver Star, and then eventually he became my colleague at Ohio State University. And one day, a colleague came by who was acting with, just a lot of bluster and attempted intimidation and so on. And he left, this guy left, and I turned to Joe and I said, does he have any idea how insecure that makes him seem? And Joe favored me with a look that basically said, you're not so dumb after all. And then he went on to add, if you're so far inside that guy's radar, look out. But yeah, I mean, once you crack the code about what that bluster and what that intimidation and so forth really means, you got something on them. Because you know that somewhere inside of them, they're weak. And if they start pushing you around, you can pretty clearly, think through the situation and figure out a way, to push back, to push the kind of button that activates that sense of fear on their part and deflates them. Takes a certain amount of experience, I guess, and so forth to figure out how to do this. But you can on the rare occasions when you've really got to push back at a toxic person. And again, this kind of man, this kind of grown man trapped within a boy psychology, that's called toxic masculinity. Moore and Gillette believed that men needed to understand what it meant to be a real man. And a real man is very different from the toxic stereotypes which too many men mistake for manhood. And by the way, there's a song by Todd Rundgren called Real Man that I want you to listen to. It's one of the other items that is required viewing, Todd Rundgren's Real Man. And to really live up to the code of the warrior, a warrior must be a complete man. He must be an example of the mature masculine, what Moore and Gillette called the warrior in his fullness. And we'll encounter such a warrior when we meet Hector in Homer's Iliad. And here's something else that I want you to watch that's required, is watch the family prayer scene from the film We Were Soldiers, which came out back in 2002. Moore and Gillette argued that there were four archetypes that were key in creating healthy, well-rounded, and mature men. First is the king, the energy of just and creative ordering. To illustrate the king, I use Atticus Finch, the widower father of two children in Depression-era Alabama, who is an attorney that defies the racist community around him to represent a black man accused of raping a young white woman. And as most of you know, Atticus Finch is the protagonist of the famous film To Kill a Mockingbird, based on the famous novel by Harper Lee. And he's probably one of the best known sort of characters in American film. Of the king, Moore and Gillette write, "This is the energy that expresses itself through a man when he takes the necessary financial and psychological steps to ensure that his wife and children prosper. This is the energy that expresses itself through a father when he takes time from work to attend his son's piano recital. This is the voice of calm reassurance, the encouraging word in a time of crisis and struggle and chaos. This is the energy that seeks peace and stability, and not only for the people in his life, but for the environment, the natural world. The king cares for the whole realm and is the steward of nature as well as of human society." Second is the magician, the energy of initiation and transformation. And I illustrate this archetype with the rock artist and songwriter Sting, one of the most innovative artists of the 1980s and 1990s. First as the lead singer of The Police, and subsequently as a solo artist. The magician, Moore and Gillette explain, is the archetype of thoughtfulness and reflection. And because of that, it is the energy of introversion, not being an introvert, but introversion. So what we mean by introversion is not shyness or timidity, but rather the capacity to detach from the inner and outer storms and to connect with deep inner truths and resources. And Sting's artistry often attempts and succeeds in connecting with deep inner truths. It's one of the things that has drawn me to his music for years. And incidentally, he was very interested in one of Carl Jung's many influential concepts. Synchronicity is what this one is called, synchronicity. What that means is coincidental events that nonetheless seem connected and thus convey a sense of some deeper motivation. Another way to express synchronicity is, quote, acausal connections between events. Now, Sting actually wrote 2 songs about synchronicity, the concept of synchronicity, both of which appear on the album Synchronicity, released in 1983 and best known for one of its singles, Every Breath You Take. Another single released, by the way, was Synchronicity 2, which you will find in the module should you be interested in listening to it. And later in the course, we will encounter another Sting song, Children's Crusade, a bitter commentary on the slaughter of British soldiers during the First World War. The lover, the energy that connects men to others and the world, is illustrated here by comedian and actor Robin Williams. The lover, Moore and Gillette explain, is the archetype of play and of display, of healthy embodiment, of being in the world of sensuous pleasure and in one's own body without shame, Thus, the lover is deeply sensual, sensually aware and sensitive to the physical world in all its splendor. The lover is related and connected to them all, drawn into them through his sensitivity. His sensitivity leads him to feel compassionately and empathetically united with them. For the man accessing the lover, all things are bound to each other in mysterious ways. The man under the influence of the lover wants to touch and be touched. He wants to touch everything physically and emotionally, and he wants to be touched by everything. Ultimately, he wants to experience the world of sensual experience in its totality. I recall an interview years ago with actress Susan Sarandon that I saw on NBC's The Today Show or something like that. And the interviewer asked Susan Sarandon to say what she thought of as being sexy. And I will never forget her reply. People who say yes to life. People who say yes to life. That is a really good thumbnail definition of the lover. Finally, we have the warrior, the energy of self-disciplined, aggressive action taken in the cause of something larger than oneself. And I would argue that this includes self-disciplined, aggressive action to grow as a person. The warrior is illustrated here by civil rights activist Malcolm X. Aggressiveness is obviously one of the warrior's chief characteristics, but this is not the same thing as belligerency. Moore Gillette asked, how does the warrior know what aggressiveness is appropriate under the circumstances? He knows through clarity of thinking, through discernment. The warrior is always alert. He is always awake. He knows how to focus his mind and his body. He is what the samurai called mindful. The warrior traditions, and we'll see this in the Code of the Warrior as we go through the various chapters. The warrior traditions all affirm that what enables a warrior to reach clarity of thought is living with his own imminent death. The warrior knows the shortness of life and how fragile it is. Rather than depressing him, this awareness leads him to an outpouring of life force and to an intense experience of his life that is unknown to others. If you're not don't have a strongly developed warrior side, you just simply don't know what this kind of mindset is like. You've never experienced it, so you're clueless. Every act, he says, counts. Every deed is done as if it were the last. Now here's an expression that has intrigued me for a long time. It is a good day to die. Widely but erroneously thought to be a translation of the Lakota Sioux battle cry Hoka-Hey. Robbie Robertson, he's the guitarist on the left of this photo. He's a Native American of Mohawk and Cayuga heritage who was a founding member of the mega rock group Band. And then went on, after he left the band, to get very interested in writing and sharing music that expressed his Native American heritage. And one example of this kind of song is called It Is a Good Day to Die, released in 1994. And so Robertson, who's Native American himself, uses the term as the title and a repeated lyric within this particular song. And by the way, the video of this song is required viewing. Now, why a war cry, a good day to die, rather than a good day to kill? Well, as a battle cry, I think it is an affirmation of the warrior's mortality and of his willingness to meet it dead on. But metaphorically, I think the term applies in a richer, though perhaps more subtle way. When I read the Moore Gillette book for the first time, I found it fascinating that they regard the hero, and they use the hero in a specialized sense. In other contexts, the way other people use the hero archetype, it equates with the warrior. With Moore and Gillette, they're using hero in a specialized kind of way, which I'll recount in a moment. Moore, Gillette regard the hero as an archetype of what they call boy psychology, and not of the mature masculine, which is where you want boys to be heading, and where you want males to be operating in the realm of the mature masculine. So a boy, and he's in this this hero place, begins by fantasizing that he is self-sufficient, a kind of superhero. You might imagine that kind of a thing. When I was a kid, I imagined myself. I used to play Army a lot. Go figure. I mean, I'm a military historian. I used to play Army with my friends a lot, and playing Army, I was always a great hero. And then sometimes, me and my friends and so forth, we would portray ourselves as superheroes, and so we would fantasize in those kinds of ways that we were like that, or that we ought to be like that. But in a boy that develops in a healthy way, and many men remain trapped in boy psychology their whole life, the hero in him, in the boy, ultimately dies. The death of the hero, Moore and Gillette maintain, is the death of boyhood, of boy psychology. And it is the birth of manhood and man psychology. The death of the hero in the life of a boy really means that he has finally encountered his limitations. And of course, because of the way in which many men are still mired in boy psychology, sometimes the death of the hero takes place not when a person is literally a boy, but at some point after they become a man. And so the death of the hero in the life of a boy or a man means that he has finally encountered his limitations. True humility, we believe, consists of two things. This is Moore and Gillette talking. The first is knowing our limitations. And the second is getting the health we need, so the help we need. Some men unknowingly remain imprisoned within the hero archetype well after they've nominally reached manhood. This is a point I've made several times now, but it really can't be underscored enough. An alcoholic, for instance, will usually insist that he's not an alcoholic. And when that illusion becomes untenable, then what he'll say is he can handle his drinking without anybody's help. This is the initial stance of Whip Whitaker, played by Denzel Washington, the protagonist of the 2012 film Flight. And in this illusion that he can handle everything himself, Whip is actually aided and abetted by a number of people who, for different reasons, want to keep his alcoholism, and in addition, his drug addiction. He also snorts cocaine. Um, they want to keep his alcoholism and that drug addiction from coming to light. But eventually, Whip's conscience at last forces him to acknowledge his helplessness to control his alcoholism, that he must admit his inability to do so, and to accept the consequences of the damage his alcoholism has done. Thus, the hero he imagines himself to be finally dies. And although in such circumstances the death of the hero entails a psychological death that feels almost like a literal death, it is indeed a good day to die, because Whip is now willing to accept the help he needs, which in turn yields in a recovery of health that is transformative, a kind of resurrection that is often experienced as such. And perhaps some of you have seen in your own lives someone who had some kind of addiction, and need not be alcoholism. Addiction can take a variety of forms, who eventually came to the realization that they were powerless over this, and who did turn to help, who went into rehab or joined Alcoholics Anonymous or something along those kinds of lines. And if you know them well, you probably realize that at the point where they realized that they needed help, that was a real, not a low point for them, but a very heavy moment that really did and does feel like a kind of death. So some of you may have seen this yourself and others. Some of you may have experienced it or will experience it in your own lives. And by the way, when it comes to many things in life, what drives us to change is not a positive desire to change. No. We usually change when we are in such pain in the position where we are that we will do anything to get out of it, and that requires change. So that's the mechanism by which this usually happens, and it's the mechanism by which it happens to Whip Whitaker in the film Flight. Now, I located on YouTube 5 scenes from Flight, which illustrate Whip's continued attempts to hide and deny his alcoholism and what ultimately forces him to confront it. The first scene, which is a scene in which he does this amazing job of successfully crash landing an airliner in circumstances that nobody else could have done. Afterward, they get into aircraft cockpits. People do, people from the National Transportation Safety Board, and they try to replicate what Whitaker was able to do in saving that aircraft, and none of them can replicate it. But at the same time, there was a suspicion among some that, despite the success that he had, he had been drinking. That particular sequence is about 9 minutes, 30 seconds long. And you don't have to watch it, but it's really, really cool. So I encourage you to watch it. The remaining 4 segments deal directly with this business of Whitaker first trying to hide his alcoholism and to try to manage it on his own, and then ultimately having to acknowledge that he is an alcoholic under pretty pretty difficult circumstances. And then you eventually see the aftermath of that once he has come to this realization and is paying the consequences for his alcoholism and what the damage that it has done. So, lastly, the idea that a mature man, in the context of battle, the warrior in his fullness, that a mature man would ask for help, including a leader in combat, led me to review my knowledge of war movies to determine whether there was such a movie in which the character of a leader does ask for help. And eventually I came upon one. I figured one out. We Were Soldiers, a 2002 film in which Mel Gibson, who's shown here, portrays Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore in a recreation of the November 1965 Battle of the Ia Drang in South Vietnam. It was the first major encounter between American forces and North Vietnamese forces during the war. And the scene in which this occurs, the scene in which Moore asks for help, is the last one you're required to view, and it is well worth it. I'll have more to say about Hal Moore in a future lecture, but for now, I wish you a good day. Take care. Take care.